Okay, it's recording. Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon from different parts of the world. Let's get started. Our today's guest, Julia, is already here with us to talk about most important topic for all the QAs out there. We'll just give a couple of more minutes so that we can have more participants. We've had an amazing number of registrations. So we'll just give a couple of more minutes and then can get started. What time is it, Julia, for you? I'm hoping it's not crazy early for you.
No, it's 9:30 in the morning. So it's a good time.
Okay. Let me see if I can. So there's a comment from my team saying the chats are disabled. I'm just figuring out. All right, I'll just figure that out. All right, I think we have a decent number of participants. Let's get started. Julia, thank you so much for joining. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us in the Voices of Community edition for November month. As you all by now know that, we have monthly editions of the Voice of Community. And in this edition, we have Julia 𝒂𝒏𝒈𝒄 with us. I was going to share some interesting insights about move forward with an effective test automation strategy, and it is quite important, in my opinion, because I've been a consultant myself before, playing this role right now, and I've had a chat with multiple people in the industry, and this was one of the questions that often come to me when I was meeting those customers is how do we strategize, and do we have a test automation strategy template and all of that. And I'm sure Julia also has must have faced such questions. At her role currently is she works for QualityWorks and heading the training and development at QualityWorks. And yeah, with no further delay, I'll hand it over to Julia. Julia, welcome again.
Thank you.
I'm very much looking forward to your talk as well.
All right, awesome. Thank you. So today we're going to talk about creating your test automation strategy. So I just want to welcome everybody to the webinar. I hope that when I'm done, you learn something that you're going to be able to take back to your team and that you can use to improve on what you already have. I am Julia 𝒂💏💈. I'm the head of training and development at QualityWorks. What that means is that I'm kind of in charge of the career growth and the career trajectory, the training, upskilling of different persons that work there. I'm also in charge of our training outreach programs. So we have different boot camps that we do. Right now, we're doing a UI automation boot camp. So we're teaching persons that aren't that familiar with coding, but they have some testing background and they want to become a test automation engineer. We have a 10-week boot camp, very intensive, but we have a 10-week boot camp that we are doing. We're teaching them JavaScript, how to find proper locator strategies, how to create a test automation strategy, how to write UI automation, what are some recommended practices, all of that. I am in the beautiful island of Jamaica. You should visit. I know right now a lot of places have snow. Jamaica is still warm and nice, so you can come here. We have good food, good vibes, good people. You can follow me on Twitter at 𝑦𝒖𝒍𝒊𝒂. I'm also on YouTube, youtube.com/Julia 𝒂𝒏𝒈𝒄. I talk about test automation there, career growth, that sort of thing. And I also blog at julia𝒂𝒑𝒕𝒊𝒂. I have a course on Test Automation University on WebDriver.io if you're interested in that framework. I know a lot of other frameworks are out there that are more popular at the moment, but I think WebDriver.io is a solid one that you can find a lot of value from. So if you're interested in that, you can check out that. So the objectives for today we're going to define what a test automation strategy is, and then I'm going to walk through some steps to create a test automation strategy. I'm going to show you a template of one that I have and walk you through what's involved in that. So a test automation strategy is the tools and frameworks that you use to get reusable automated scripts, as well as how you can create those scripts and maintain them. Maintenance is really important. So your test automation strategy is going to define that. A test automation strategy is most effective when everyone on your team understands, understands what is going on, because they're going to be the one that is going to implement it. So you want to have a strategy that allows your team to understand it so that you can get the return on investment. You want faster time to market, more reliable, faster test. However, in order to do that, it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, and you don't just want to dive into it without first having an automation strategy. So your strategy is going to define how you're going to go about it, who is going to be writing it, what are you going to be automating, why are you doing automation in the first place, when do you automate, at what levels do you automate, what environments. And so we're going to break that down, the how, the why, the who, the what, and the when. The first thing that you want to do when creating a test automation strategy is identify the why. Why do you want to have automated tests? Have you sat and thought about that? What is the goal that you're trying to achieve by saying we're going to move from doing exploratory testing, manual testing, these types of testing, to now have some automated testing working alongside that? There are several goals that you may have. You may want to have a faster time to market. You may want to have automation ready at the same time that features are being built. So you maybe want to have automation in the same sprint as the features that you're being developed in, as the features that are being developed. You may want to not have as much manual testing for your regression suite. Your regression suite may be taking a really long time to execute. And by introducing automation, you may be able to reduce that time. I have seen some persons have large regression suites that they have to spend days with multiple people going through. And so by having automation, that has allowed them to spend a little less time or a lot less time running those manually. And they can instead focus on different edge cases that may exist. You may also want to have more coverage. And so by using automation and data-driven testing to generate different user scenarios and unique scenarios, it may be easier with automation. You may also be transitioning from a waterfall to an agile approach, and you want to introduce continuous testing, continuous integration. That, along with other reasons, can be why you have test automation. The next thing after you have your goal is to think about who. And the who is very important. So you have defined your goal. You want to have test automation because you're transitioning from agile. You're transitioning to agile and you want it in a CI/CD pipeline. That may be your goal. Your goal may be that you want to have test automation running alongside the development tickets, right? Whatever your goal is, who is going to execute that goal? You'll need to have a team that can write tests, execute them, check for failures when they happen, update the scripts, create reports so that you can see if you're getting the value, maintain them, write regression tests, etc. It's a whole project and it's a whole lot of work. So you're going to need a team, and I recommend a dedicated team that is going to be looking at what you're doing and understand it and be able to execute that. Normally, persons, when they're trying to decide who is going to be on their team, they immediately default to the strongest technical person. That doesn't always have to be the case. I think that there should be a proper mix between junior and senior persons. Now, the senior members of your team, they're going to be more experienced in the language that you select and the framework that you select, so that they can create test automation frameworks independently. But you also want your junior members of the team to be able to learn from that person. So if you have a senior-junior relationship, there's always going to be somebody on your project that is able to maintain it and create new tests. And this is going to help the junior members of your team learn at a faster rate because they're on a project where they're learning test automation from someone with experience. Now, sometimes you may not have anyone in your organization. You may have to look and see that you need to hire. If that's the case, you will have to think about, what will that job description say? What am I looking for this person or persons to have? If you don't want to hire, and let's say you already have a good sized team, you have persons on your team, but they are maybe exploratory testers, manual testers, they haven't written test automation before. That's where training can come in. And so I do training for a lot of different teams that want to learn how to do test automation. So you can train your team as well, but training takes time and it's something that you have to plan out and think about. You have to think about, do they have a programming language? Do they already know how to find locators? Have they ever used a test automation framework? If they haven't, then you have to create that curriculum to guide them to a point where they are able to do that. So thinking about who is going to be on your project is a big question, because you want to ensure that you have the right match, you have the right team, and you want to give that team enough time to do what the goal is, to achieve the goal. You don't want to have your team still having to do their day-to-day work and then you tack on an automation project on top of that. That's going to be intensive and you don't want people to be burnt out. So consider automation as a project in itself that needs to be given that time and a dedicated team with the right people that you may have to hire or you may have to train to get them to where you want them to be. The next question when creating a test automation strategy is what? So you have the goal, you have who is going to be writing it, but what are you going to automate? Now, deciding what to automate allows you to zone in on the key areas that are going to give you the best return on investment. You don't want to dive in straight without a plan, and you need to know at what level you're going to automate. So you can either just automate unit tests. So unit tests are going to validate small components and functionalities. This is typically done by developers. So you may just decide that I don't want to hire persons to do UI right now. We're going to start by automating our unit tests if we haven't been doing so already. Then you may want to work, you may have a lot of APIs. And so having API testing is probably going to be important for you. So you want to do the service layer. You want somebody that can automate your APIs, automate your database, and verify how this works. Then you may be heavily driven in the user interface. Now, you can have persons that do UI automation. So you have to decide for your project, for your situation, what level is important, and also know that certain levels run faster than others. Certain levels are less prone to failure than others. So you have to consider all those factors. Outside of the level, I generally have a rule of thumb in terms of things that I am going to be automating. I consider the goal and I ensure that the goal is aligning with that. So if my goal was to reduce the amount of regression tests that we have to do manually, then I'm going to be automating regression tests. So if that is one of your goals, then you may want to prioritize that, right? Some things that you may want to automate are smoke tests. So smoke tests ensure that the most important aspects, the most basic components of an application are functioning correctly. They test areas that always need to work. So by automating your smoke test, you can detect show-stopping bugs early, such as if your app or web page isn't loading, if your user isn't able to log in, if payment services are down, things like that. Having automated smoke tests can help you catch. Regression tests, if you have those, it's going to allow you to have a set of stable tests, because based on regression, these are things that are already out there and should be working. So having those set of stable tests that these are the critical functions of the application, these are existing functionalities that have been testing multiple times. And so if it fails, then you can start to debug that. I also like to automate exhaustive tests, and exhaustive tests talks about those with large sets of data, such as forms. If you're required to do the same workflow multiple times, but with a wide variety of data, you can create data-driven automation that is going to allow you to save some time. Now, data-driven automation is very beneficial, as it allows you to not only modify the data, but as it allows you to modify the data of the script and get different results. And it's very reusable, it's very efficient. I also like to test things that have multiple configurations. So you can use LambdaTest to generate different operating system, different browsers. You can incorporate that into your test automation and give you a different combination of always devices, screen sizes, all of that, because you want to ensure that when persons are using your applications, it doesn't just work on what you, the tester, have. It works on what the actual customers are going to be using. And then you also want to do performance tests. So you want to avoid launch failures, bad user experiences, things that are taking too long to load, things that don't work properly. You check the speed, you check the response time, you check the reliability and the scalability. Let's say you're having a big launch. For example, maybe you're having a Black Friday sale or a Cyber Monday sale, and you're expecting a lot of customers to come. How do you test for that? And how do you ensure that the store won't go down at that time? So this list of things is not exhaustive by any means. There are lots of other things that you can automate, but this is a great starting point to decide and to consider, am I going to include these things into my automation strategy? Are these possible things that I may want to automate? So be strategic and focused, and sit with your current team, see what they're currently having issues with, see what bottlenecks are currently there, and see how you can use automation to solve that. The next question you want to ask is how. So how are you going to go about running your automated tests? You'll need to find a specific tool. You'll need to find a specific framework that fits your project needs. In deciding what tool to use, you first need to consider at what level you're going to be doing. So if you're doing API automation or database or visual regression, there are different tools, there are different technologies that can be used for each. So for API automation, you may use Postman, you may use Supertest if you're using JavaScript, you may use Rest Assured if you're using Java. So there's a wide range of tools to be considered based on what exactly you're going to be testing. The language that you're going to be using is very important as well. So you have Selenium WebDriver that can be used in many different languages. You can use it in Java, Python, JavaScript, Ruby, etc. And Selenium allows you to pair with Appium. That is if you want to do mobile automation. But in addition to Selenium WebDriver, there are other tools in the JavaScript ecosystem. There's WebDriver.io, Cypress, Playwright, etc. So there are a lot of different tools that you have to consider, different programming languages. You can decide that maybe you want to use the same programming language that your developers are using, especially if you want them to be a part of the test automation process and you kind of want a whole team approach. So you can decide to do that. You can also consider the language that the members of your team knows. So if more persons know JavaScript and are maybe familiar with a particular framework, you may lean that way. So there are lots of different things that you have to consider that will help you decide, am I going to be using this language, this framework, this tool? You also want to think about the scenarios that you want to test. Are there any unique scenarios? Are there any edge case scenarios? And the tool that you're going to be selecting, does it solve for these unique scenarios? You don't want to have a tool that the more important scenarios it's not going to do. You're going to have to use an next tool on it. So think about it. For example, if cross-browser testing is important to you, you may want to use LambdaTest in your automation strategy. You also then have to consider, what was my goal in the first place? And this is something that should always be on your mind when creating your automation strategy. What is my goal? If you had continuous integration as a goal, you will then need to start look at continuous integration, continuous delivery pipelines and tools that can offer you that service. And then the cost of the tool. A lot of companies do have budgets. There are tools that are free to the community, but there are also tools that are paid for. So think about, how much are you willing to spend, if any, to get what you want done. So once you have those things, I normally like to create a table with all the features that I want to automate, as well as must-haves for different tools. And then I have a list of my more important things. And I'm writing out a list of top 6 tools. And then I'm adding a check mark to the tools that meet a certain criteria that I'm looking for. Once I have that, I then select my top 2 and I do a proof of concept with my edge cases to see, is it going to satisfy not only the everyday tests, but these edge cases that are really important to me. So this stage is going to take a lot of time, is going to take a lot of research, but you have to take the time to carefully evaluate the tool, because you're going to have that tool for a long while. I've been in companies where they are quote unquote stuck with a tool because management have already paid a certain amount of money for it. So it's now at a point where we have to use this tool because we already have a subscription for 5 years, or we already have a subscription for this number of time, even though that tool is not the best tool or framework for the job. So you don't want to be in a situation of regret. So take the time to think about what tool you're going to use and why you're going to be using that tool. The next thing is where and when. So this is kind of the final thing that you want to consider for a solid test automation strategy. You've talked about the goal, you've talked about who, you've talked about what, you've talked about how, but where and when. So I think a lot of us should have a dedicated test environment. If not, then I would suggest that your automation runs in a dedicated test environment. The reason for this is because it allows you to manipulate the data so that you can get different scenarios for testing. So if you want a suspended user, if you want a newly created user, if you want a user with things already in their cart, you want a user with a blocked credit card, whatever the scenarios are in your test environment, it's your safe space to kind of play with that data and create those different scenarios. Once you do that, think about the work that may be involved in creating this dedicated environment if you don't have one, and include that in your automated strategy or plan to get it implemented. Now, with the dedicated test environment, I'm not saying that you aren't going to be running your test on production. I think you should, and I also suggest that you run your test on production. However, first, you can run them on your test environment where you have certain users. The tests that you're going to be running on production, they should be tagged so that only specific tests are run. You don't want to have delete queries or delete users and somebody in the real world no longer have an account or no longer have a purchase history because you ran a test and deleted their information. So be very careful with production automated tests. Tag them correctly to ensure that only what should be run in production is actually run. So have an execution plan for your test. I have a list of questions that I typically answer at this stage. And these questions are, do you need to set up specific data for your test? Do you need to make database connections or API calls? How does the data that you have in your test need to be masked? How do you set up your test? How do you tear down your test after so that it doesn't impact other tests that may come later on? Are you going to be running these tests locally on your computer? Are you going to be using a continuous integration system? Are there specific times that you want your test to run? Is there a trigger for when your automated test is going to be executed? What repositories are you going to be using to store code? Do you have a process for merging and for pull request approvals? And how are you going to be reporting your automated test run? It's a lot of detail to consider. It's going to take time. So ensure that you consider all of these details, right? So those are the questions that you are going to ask. And so after asking those questions, I suggest that you create a strategy template. I normally use a Word doc or a mind map like this to work alongside my team that is going to be a part of the automation plan and the execution just to create the strategy. So we're going to go through this strategy template a bit. So the first thing is an overview. So this overview is going to be the goal of your strategy. It's going to talk about what you're trying to achieve. So frame it in that way. It's going to allow you to work on the other areas to ensure that it matches back to the goal. So if after you have everything, you're still not able to achieve the goal, then you have to kind of do some rework because everything should come back to having the goal being achieved. Then automation frameworks. So have your automation frameworks of choice for unit testing, for API, database, UI, etc. You add that here. Then you have testing types. So am I going to be doing smoke testing, functional testing, regression, visual validation, etc. Then you have testing areas. So enter features that will be automated. Are you going to be automating your regression? Are you going to be automating payment? Are you going to be automating authentication? So think about what you'll be authenticating. And then timeline. So you want to give yourself a time box to automate specific features or to get to a certain point, because it's a project. It should be treated like a project. It should have a timeline of how am I going to get these features done by a certain time? If it is that your goal, for example, was to have automation in the sprint, you can maybe use the sprint guidelines to also be close to this automated plan timeline as well. So think about all of that. And then platforms. So you have different web browsers, you have different mobile devices, you have different service layers, you have different operating system. What platforms are you going to be running it? So this is the where and the when as well that you want to put here. And then test environment, still the where and when. So your QA environment, your staging environment, your production environment. This strategy, when your team comes to it, they should immediately know all the information. They should immediately know that, okay, we run our automation here. We also do it on production. I'm going to look for some production tags, that sort of thing. And then execution. How will you run your automated test? Is it going to be scheduled? Are you going to use cross-browser platform testing, etc.? Then automation code management. Where will you store the code? Are you going to be using pull request? How does the review process look? Your team needs to know this. Does it take 2 approval for my pull request to be merged in? Is there a check that it needs to pass before it can be merged in? Stuff like that. Limitation and risk. Enter any risk that there may be. There may be a budget risk. There may be staffing risk. You may need to hire. That's any risk that will affect the completion of this project, this automation. Enter it here. And then finally, reporting. Enter the tools that will be used for reporting. How will reports be shared? What metrics are you going to use to measure and share those? Because when you're talking with different stakeholders, they want to know different metrics. So think about what metrics your managers will need to know, what metrics the members of your team will need to know, what metrics developers, project owners, etc. will need to know, and see what reporting tools you can use to achieve. So let's do a quick recap. Test automation strategy should be understood by your entire team. They should be involved in the decision regarding the tools you're going to use, the techniques, the types of tests that you want to run. First, identify your goal. This is going to determine who's going to be on your team, the types of tests that are important, the types of tools you may use, how you can get the goal completed, etc. After thinking about your goal, think about who's going to be on your team, who's going to be creating those tests. Do they need to training? Do I need to hire? Do I have a good mix of senior and junior team members? And then ensure your test is maintainable. Maintenance takes time. So give your team enough time to create those tests and maintain them if something happens. Then what? So think about what level you want to test on. What types of tests do you want to use? And then think about what tools, what tools are you going to be using? What frameworks are you going to be using? Is there a particular language? And then where and when, think about, do you want it on a CI/CD pipeline? Are you going to be running it locally? And then use something like a mind map to create a framework to share with everyone on your team. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned something. You can stay connected with me on Twitter at 𝑗76, LinkedIn, my blog, juliapottinger.com, and my YouTube channel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julia. That was quite an insightful and valuable advices. I think I could very much relate into a couple of things that you mentioned it around, especially around the test environments and all of that. I'm sure all of you would be facing such situations. I think can't agree more on environments being one of the biggest problems, especially if you're into continuous testing aspects.
Yeah, definitely, because sometimes you don't think about it beforehand. And so it does take a lot of, it does take work to prepare these environments, to get them set up to how exactly you want them. And sometimes because they're not set up properly, when we automate and we get failures, it's not necessarily the test. Sometimes it's the environment that gives an issue. So we just want to ensure that those are done properly as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have some questions coming in. Folks, thanks for asking those questions. If you have already done, we have more time and we can keep Julia busy and make the most of it. And let me pick the first question is, Julia, I'm going to pick a to prepare a full strategy that will convince your customer for incorporating it?
Okay, so based on how we work, we normally do an assessment first, because we're a consulting company at QualityWorks. So we go in, we do an assessment, and that assessment can take from a week to 2 weeks based on the size of the organization. So we do that assessment, and in that assessment, it allows us to get kind of a maturity score, like, do they already have any test automation in place? What types of knowledge is on their team? Does anybody already know test automation, that kind of thing? And from that, then we can decide how long it's going to take for us to do a strategy. But we normally do an assessment first. A strategy can take, because we have a template and we have templates that we use, it can take from a week more, because there's a review process involved. Because we consider the features of the application, we have to get the client involvement to say, are these the areas that are high priority to you? Sometimes they don't know what their goal is. So that takes some time to kind of wrangle, like, why are you going to be doing test automation in the first place? So I would say it can be from a week to more, based on the size of the team, the size of the project, the size of what you're going to be doing. And because it's such a involved process, you want the feedback of a lot of persons. You want everybody that's going to be doing it to feel like they have a say. It's a lot of different meetings, a lot of different brainstorming about what exists, what they maybe have paid for a tool already. So it's a lot of information gathering. So I would say give yourself at least a week to get all of that together, and then you can start putting it together.
Yeah, wonderful. I think thanks, Julia. Slightly related question. It was particularly interesting for me. I'm sure it will be helpful for all of this as well. Do you recommend any particular type of personas to be available for that session during the assessment, both on the vendor side as well as on the customer side?
Yeah, so you definitely want the persons that are familiar with the project. So that can be developers, that can be the product owner, that can be manual testers that currently exist. And why? Because you're going to be automating the product. So you need to have that product knowledge. You need to find out what areas are currently being bottlenecks. What areas do we currently spend a lot of time doing manual testing, and it makes us spend 3 days testing before we can even get out a release. And even with the 3 days, we still have areas that are left untouched. So you can get that knowledge from persons that have been on the project, persons that have been hands-on. So you definitely need those persons. Then you also need management to kind of give some approvals, budget, that kind of thing. So those are the two main group of people that I would say need to be there. From our side, we typically have an automation architect or a solutions engineer, somebody that is familiar with a lot of different tools and frameworks, someone that have implemented a lot of strategy before, somebody that has that knowledge on, and also people skills to maneuver the conversations that need to be had.
Absolutely. I can imagine the whole of assessment itself will be challenging, because you'll involve a lot of stakeholders, and not everyone will be up for sharing information at first place. So it's tough navigating through a lot of those struggles. And
sometimes
any idea
you
of how
have to
long?
go back. Sometimes you have to go back to them, rephrase the question, prompt them a different way.
Yeah. And especially this helps if it's in person. If it's in remote, I think it has its own challenges. So
yeah,
definitely can understand that. I think there's a follow-up question from AK. He says thank you. And
awesome.
The second question is, what is the most common issue or set of issues that comes in your way to deliver what you have drafted in your strategy? That's some kind of a promise, right? I think that's what he asks.
Sometimes, so after you've created the strategy, life happens. So if you've created a strategy and you said, I'm going to get it done in this time and we're going to get these features, and then all of a sudden the project is no longer focused on those features. So those features are no longer important. That have happened where it's kind of, they've taken a shift. So the features or the project that we've gone in to automate is no longer important. And we're on a completely different project. So we now have to, okay, we're on a completely different project. They're expecting some deliverables. How do we do a quick, really quick, like a 2-hour strategy and start automating something and then spend some time in the background, kind of feeling out the team and seeing how that plan evolves. So that have happened in the past where we've gone in to do one thing and then it's a completely different project. So that's been kind of difficult, but we've managed to get that done. So something also that I've had to learn over the years is estimation of time. Because even when you're doing your story pointing, you're kind of estimating the effort and how long this is going to take, right? In the same way, if you're going to automate something, you have to think about how long is it going to take me to automate this feature? How long is it going to take me to automate this project? And so I've found that that's kind of where you don't want to overpromise. You don't want to say, oh, it can be done in this short time. You want to add buffers, if anything, because there's going to be, when writing code, some failures that is staring at you right in your face that you can't figure out what the issue is. And sometimes you have to do a peer program session and somebody comes and they're like, okay, you misspelled this word. This is why your code is failing, right? So just try to give yourself buffers in terms of time.
Wonderful. That was detailed. Thanks, Julia. Next question I'm going to pick up is from, okay, before question, I think there's been a lot of comments and people find it valuable on the mind map that you shared. So people are asking, is that downloadable? Can you share it? I think all that
I do have a link. I need to find it.
Okay, so it's shareable. So folks, thanks for asking that. I think we can just add it as a tweet that we post even so that you all can get it. And also it'll be part of the slide pack. Cool. Thanks, Julia, for that. Next question is from Tom Lester. Great presentation, Julia. I'm struggling with organization structure. Can you talk about the pros and cons of having a separate team that owns the automated test versus having automation tests created and maintained by each agile team functional domain?
Okay, so let me see if I get this right. You either have one team that does all the test automation for every project, or each project have their own automated team. Both can be good in terms of the number of persons that may be in the organization. So if you just have 5 persons, you don't want to you maybe just want them to be in charge of it. And for example, if you have 10 projects, you don't want to like split up and maybe have one person in charge of 2 projects. So I'm thinking of it from that aspect. Based on the number of persons that are on your team, you can decide if it would be less overwhelming for them to be split up in that way. But a benefit of having persons dedicated to a project is that they get that specific project knowledge. And so they can now start to think about the best test that should be automated. They're more familiar with the errors that may occur. They're more familiar and in sync with release times. And so they can know, okay, I should trigger my test in the CI/CD platform on a Thursday at 3:00 because that's when releases tend to go out. So there is a certain benefit when you have somebody dedicated to a specific project because it allows them to be more familiar and they now get to do more work on that one, and they can then start to think of edge cases and they can become more creative, do some data-driven testing, maybe adding some API testing into the mix. So it allows them that kind of time. So I always prefer that option where somebody is dedicated to one, maybe max 2 projects instead of maybe just having a team. You want them to be integrated also with the developers and the other members of the team. The other way where you just had a QA team, it sounds a bit silo-ish. So you may not want to have that silo.
Oops, finding my mute button. Yeah, cool. Slightly related, there's a question from Sudarshan. He's asking any specific advice on automating tests in Sprint And I think it's related because you were highlighting on the aspect of having people dedicated to it, because you have the project context, the domain, and all of it. So how any specific advice do you think can give for the in-sprint automation?
So in-sprint is going to be before and in sprint. So what I mean by before and in sprint, as a QA doing that, what I've had to do is start looking at what's at the top of the backlog coming up and start framing my mind around the test cases that I would possibly want to include. And then when the developer is working on the task, I can say to him, what are some locators that you are possibly thinking of using? So to get in-sprint automation done, you're going to need to have a real relationship with the developer, because the time that you normally get to test after something is developed is not a lot. So you need to start writing your automation while the developer is developing it. So if there can be an agreement to say, this is what's the word? This is kind of the structure of how we have locators or selectors. Then in your automation test, you can start writing out the functionality, because a lot of time the ticket should be clear enough to say, if it's authentication, this is what is going to happen. So you can create those scenarios and you can start writing out your test from early. Once it is that the developer has finished, all you probably need to plug in is the correct locators, verify that the functionality that you were thinking about matches, and correct any errors that may happen. So a big tip is to start early. So as soon as the sprint starts, don't wait for the ticket to be developed before you start automating it. There's a lot that you can do and write before that happens.
Cool. Next question I can pick from Li Shangxiang. Thanks for sharing. I presume that you would have a combination of tests for a project. Which would you prioritize, and what would those tests be? End-to-end, functional, unit, regression, etc.
It depends on the goal. So I've talked a lot about what the goal is. So if the goal is that I have a lot of regression tests and they're slowing up a lot of my time because I can't get through them enough in a quick time, then that may be my priority. If, for example, it's a lot of data and it's hard for me to manipulate, then I may have data-driven tests. So you have to think about your goal and then prioritize based on which is going to help you achieve your goal more. And regression tests are functional tests. Regression tests can be end-to-end tests. So there can be some overlap with that grouping of functional, end-to-end, and regression. So just think about what your goal was in the first place and how a specific test is going to help you achieve that.
Sense. I think there was a similar question. How would you prioritize different tests? I think that pretty much answers that. There's a couple of thank yous, so I'm gonna convey that to you. And there's also a very common question. What's your view on codeless automation tools? Does it add velocity into overall software delivery? The team might also need to upskill on code automation as well.
Yeah, so there has been in the last year or two a lot of codeless automation tools that have been coming. I have checked out one or two. I am not the biggest fan, so I may be a bit biased because I like creating my own test automation framework. But I've seen where they've worked and I've seen where they are improving now. So 5 years ago, I would have been like, no, don't use codeless automation tools. But I have seen where they are actually delivering what they said they're going to be. So there are a lot of different companies and ones that you can try out. So I am not against it if it's something that your team doesn't have the time to train right now to learn a programming language, etc. Then you can try that out, but it has to be done by creating proof of concepts to see which one is going to be best for you. So it's not just about coded or not, or codeless. You still have to go through the steps of creating a proof of concept to see which one of these is going to be better for you. Is the codeless automation tool going to be able to automate your edge cases? Does it have community support? If something goes wrong, are you going to be able to debug it? So all of those considerations still have to be taken in place. But if that's what's best for you and your team, then go for it.
Well said. Next question from Tom Lester again. Our product supports thousands of configuration options. We are debating having tests configure the environment to their needs versus having many environments pre-configured in different ways to cover the configuration space. Any guidance here?
All right. So let me find that one because I think I need to see it. Okay.
Yeah.
So our product support thousands of configuration options. We're debating between having tests configure the environment to their needs. Okay. Versus having many environments pre-configured in different ways to cover the configuration space. That's a very specific question. Thinking about it, you may have to think about the cost of creating the environments. How many environments would you need to have pre-configured? And what would the cost of that be? Versus if the tests are going to configure the environment, do they tear down the environment afterwards so that it releases memory or storage or space, or it cleans up back the database? So which one would probably be more feasible, more budget efficient? Also, which one is going to take less time as well for your test to run? Because if each test needs to configure an environment, it's going to take some time. Depends on the process that you have, I'm assuming. It could take some time to configure the environment. That's a tricky question. I'm not sure which way to go because it depends on a lot of different factors. But look on the pros and cons of each, also the cost. So that would be my suggestion as to what you can do. But you said thousands of configurations. So how many? Maybe create a table to see which configurations overlap, and to see maybe even though it's thousands, maybe you can get like 50 from that would address majority of them and have those configured. And then for the ones that are too unique, you can have them create their own environment.
Cool. I hope that answered your question, Tom. If not, I think there's a Twitter, link that Julia has shared, has handled, so we could have a chat. Next question is from CD Malabnan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name correct, but apologies if it is wrong. The question is, you were mentioned earlier that you've experienced working on a test automation tool that is being used by a company, but not the best to use based on your assessment. Can you describe more how and what approach did you take? Did you force your test strategy using the tool? Talk to them using which is a better one?
Okay. So for that particular project, we did use the tool that they had. And why was because the job that we were hired to do was to use their existing tool. But what we did was we trained, or we created presentations while we were there on better tools that could be used. And we created like a comparison list to say, this tool would have solved this in XYZ way. And now they are using the recommended tool, but in the moment, because they had, and the urgency of what they needed to do, we had to start using their tool and create some automation with their tool. And while we were there, I think the engagement was for a year, we showed them that there were different options, and that had to go up to management and get approved and all of that stuff. And they had like a license of maybe 2 or 3 years left. So they used out their license and then they changed to what we had suggested. So it took a while. It wasn't something that just happened immediately. We still had to use what they needed. If it wasn't something that they were paying for, then it would have been easier to just change. It was something that they were paying for. They already had tests on it and that sort of thing. So it was a bit more difficult to just get them to change immediately.
Yeah, I think always these war stories are very interesting, especially if you're a consultant, if not every customer is the same. So
yeah,
thanks for the question from the attendees. Thanks, Julie, again. So it's another question that I'm pick more of a newbie from Asha. Any guidelines for the person who starts the automation alone with the new tool?
Read the documentation. So the documentation for tools, and I'm finding that even now, like, because I'm teaching persons that are new, I'm trying to have to say, remember the documentation, because sometimes if you just search for something, it will pop up a list of things that can help you. So if it's a new tool, read the documentation, see if they have a community that you can join. A lot of tool vendors now have communities on Slack or somewhere else that you can join and ask your questions. So see how that can help you.
Sounds good. I hope that answered, Asha. Thank you so much. All right, that's pretty much it. We are right on time. It's like 3 minutes to close, and I just wanted to make some housekeeping, in a message to people. Gonna use the remaining minutes for that. So thank you everyone for joining the third edition of Voices of Community, November edition. And Julia, thanks again. It was such a wonderful and insightful session. I'm not sure if you've seen the chat. We have actually people from all over the globe. Just to pick some countries' name, we have people from Tunisia, Poland, Singapore, Vietnam, Budapest, London, US, what more countries you can ask for. It's definitely you can be proud of, I'm sure. And I think which also means how important this topic is, and we can definitely have more such sessions in the future. I'm just posting a link on the comment box, chat box for you all, and if you wanted actually more such sessions or what sort of topics that you would want to hear, please use that Google form. It has some questions around any specific topics you want to hear or any specific speaker that you wanted to bring in on board on this platform. I will be happy to do the best and bring in experts like Julia, and then make it a truly global event and for the community. Thank you so much. And Julia, thank you again. And I'm sure people are waiting for that, the mind map.
I'll send it to you and you can share it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And any last words to the attendees from your side?
Thank you for joining. I'm really happy that you learned a lot. Just remember to give yourself time, because everything takes a little time. So give yourself time and do the research and you'll be good.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. See you next month. Next month, it's not going to be the traditional, a webinar session. Next month, we have more and interesting announcements to make, which I announced. If you follow TestMu, the conference that we organize at LambdaTest, on the closing note, I mentioned we are bringing in new initiatives for the community, and we are going live on one of the new initiatives that we bought. So stay tuned for the announcements on social media. And if you do like what we did in this webinar, make sure, if you feel like, please post on Twitter and LinkedIn. See you all next month at a very interesting announcements. Till then, enjoy and take care.